Welcome to Abrons Arts Center, and thank you for joining us. Abrons Arts Center is situated on the Lenape island of Mannahatta in Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We would like to acknowledge the diasporic Lenape nations and our commitment to creating pathways for their homecoming. Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, Anadarko, Oklahoma. Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Community, Wisconsin. Moravian Delaware of the Thames, Ontario, Canada. Munsee Delaware Nation, Ontario, Canada. Delaware of Six Nations, Ontario, Canada. In order for us to gather safely, we encourage you to wear a mask over your nose and mouth at all times. As a reminder, food, drinks, smoking, and vaping are not permitted in the theater. Now, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones and any other noise-making devices. In the event of an emergency, please follow the nearest exit signs. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, it's such a full house. Thank you so much for spending a Friday evening at the Abrons Arts Center. My name is Gonsalves, and I'm the Vice President of Visual and Performing Arts at the Henry Street Settlement and the Executive Director of the Abrons Arts Center. And on behalf of the entire team here, thank you so much for joining us for Why We Collect. Cues applause. Thank you for that. So Why We Collect is a public program that's presented as part of Objects of Permanence, which is an exhibition curated by Mellány Sánchez that's on view here at Abrons Arts Center through September 14th. Was anyone at the opening? Yay! It was so wonderful. And we're super excited to have this conversation be part of the exhibition. So on the occasion of New York Fashion Week, this exhibition celebrates the New York City garment industry and its labor force, featuring artifacts on loan from the Tenement Museum, artifacts from the New York City garment labor force, as well as imagined artifacts from contemporary fashion designers. And we're super thrilled to partner with the Tenement Museum on this exhibition and on the co-presentation of this public program. And it marks our first institutional collaboration. So we're super excited to be working with our neighbors. Did anyone go to the Tenement Museum as a child? Did anyone grow up in New York City and go? Yes, exactly. And just to plug an additional program that we're presenting as part of the exhibition are some tenement apartment tours tomorrow at the museum. So folks haven't gotten their tickets, it's their free tour, so we encourage you to stop by our partner as well. So for tonight's conversation, I am super excited to welcome such an illustrious group of panelists who together are going to be sharing their perspectives on how and why we form collections and the roles of garments in our collective community storytelling. So of course, our moderator for this conversation is the wonderful Objects of Permanence curator, Mellány Sánchez, who's a creative director from the borderlines of Queens and Brooklyn. And included in this conversation are Dr. Valerie Steele, the director and chief curator of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she has organized more than 25 exhibitions since 1997. We have also Jessica Gonsalves, the co-founder of Procell, a destination vintage apparel boutique in the Bowery neighborhood of downtown Manhattan, also neighbors of ours. And then finally, we have Kathryn Lloyd, who's the Vice President of Programs and Interpretation at the Tenement Museum, where she develops museum programming and educator training, and has been such a key partner in making all of this possible. So thank you so much, Kathryn. Tonight we have ASL interpretation. Our access providers are Samantha Wade and Gloria Vargas of Sign Nexus. Also, to conclude, and then I'll really stop talking because we want to talk to them. Tonight's conversation is being recorded. The Tenement Museum is live streaming this right now onto their YouTube page, so it will be on the Tenement Museum's YouTube page for future enjoyment or for folks who weren't able to join us for tonight's event. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mellány. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ali. Ali Rosales, the director of the Arts Center. So thank you so much to Ali for all of your support and making Objects of Permanence and this panel possible. So excited to see you all here today. Thank you for making it out, as Ali said, on a Friday evening. There's some weather things happening this week in New York, but we're all here, we're all safe, and feeling good and cool in this room. Really happy to be sharing the stage with these women. And I want to just jump into the questions. I think the first thing that I would like to just sort of draw attention to is why these women, why this title, why this group of questions. The questions above are the questions we're going to address. No surprises here, but what I really want us to walk away with is an answer to, a roadmap to, guides to how to form collections and why, and sort of leaving our audience and anyone watching at home to have understandings of how to better do that themselves. And I think that leaning into your expertise and letting us know exactly how you form collections is the way that we are going to leave everyone with something great to go home with. So this collection of women, as Ali told you, is Dr. Valerie Steele, we have Jess Gonsalves of Procell, and we have Kathryn Lloyd. And the reason why, the traffic is, it's real. Okay. What I identified with this group of women was, wow, experts at bringing things together and telling stories and doing community storytelling with garments in many, many different ways, right? And on different levels, and in many ways they intersect in our neighbors. You think about the Tenement Museum being right next to Procell, but offering totally different things. You collect real stories from real New Yorkers, you collect real garments from real New Yorkers, you collect real garments and artifacts from real designers, and they're presented in the most, in the most elevated way possible. So help us get there, help us understand what it is that you collect, and let's start with Dr. Valerie Steele, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Museums have been collecting items of dress for centuries, and different kinds of museums have collected different sorts of dress and for different reasons, whether considering it as an art or a piece of history or a kind of decorative art that could be used to teach artisans and designers how to do things better. The museum at FIT is a division of the Fashion Institute of Technology, so it's a university college museum. And it began in 1969 as the design laboratory, and they borrowed things from the Brooklyn Museum and started to acquire their own collection to teach designers and students how to take inspiration from past fashion and from dress from around the world. And then they built the building and they added design laboratory and galleries. And so even before the building went up, they had live fashion shows back in the days when people were allowed to wear historic fashion. That's very much frowned on now. But since then, we've been collecting fashion that is historically and/or artistically important. And the oldest accessory we have is a pair of shoes from the 17th century, man's high heel shoes. And the earliest clothes are 18th century, right up to the present. So that's our kind of remit, but different museums would choose different kinds of things. I know we had a TV crew from France come, and they said, you have hand-embroidered blue jeans that some hippie wore. French Art Museum would never collect that. So it's not just couture, we're collecting all kinds of vernacular garments that tell different stories, because we know designers were inspired by, for example, hippie clothes where the embroidery was done by the wearer's girlfriend.
Thank you for that, Valerie. Wow, I love that initial extraction where the collection was formed for the purposes of inspiration, and I think someone who very much understands inspiration from garments is Jess Gonsalves at Procell. The business of Procell is sometimes inspiration. Can you tell us what it is that you collect?
Thank you, Mel. So, as everyone said, I'm Jess. I'm from Procell. We're a vintage shop over on Delancey. We're not, I think, the typical vintage shop in the same way that you had a French TV crew come and be amazed that you had jeans from hippies. I think for some people, a vintage store conjures like dusty, mothball, dirty, messy, and we are a total 180 from that. When Procell opened in 2012, Brian and I, my partner in the business, in the shop, and also we have an archive, we really chose to showcase and highlight a different kind of mix of things. So clothes that were worn by different subcultures in New York City, clothes that were worn on the Paris runway, the Milan runway, those things all mix in our shop. Our focus is definitely on apparel and clothing, but we also do hats, accessories, ephemera that is adjacent to fashion, and high fashion and street fashion. We always like to say we have a mix. You know, a t-shirt from the Misfits sits next to a Chanel runway piece, sits next to Polo Ralph Lauren in our store, and they all go together in our world. So we have really honed in on focusing on, I would say our main focus is the 90s, we get a little into the 80s, we get into the early 2000s. And you know, every once in a while we'll be really off track and get something from the 70s in the shop, but mainly we specifically focus on about 30 to 40 years ago for what we choose to highlight.
Thank you for that. And now I'm thinking about the decades, and I'm thinking about the Tenement Museum and the many, many decades. I'm thinking now, how can you possibly form collections? How do you make decisions about what it is that you bring into the Tenement Museum? There are centuries of history of New Yorkers and the lives they live, and you tell them so eloquently. So what is it that you do collect there?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me as part of the conversation. And you know, unlike your collections, but maybe sort of similar to, we're unlike it in that we actually don't have a lot of garments in our collection, but we are similar to your collections in that the objects that the Tenement Museum has are sort of untraditional, right? And our what we collect is actually really related to our how we collect, in that a lot of our collection was just found in our building, right? The main Tenement Museum building hadn't been lived in for 53 years, from 1935 to 1988. So our first collection was just all the stuff that people left behind, sort of by accident, right? Things that fell under floorboards or were behind fireplaces. And that collection really became the essence of our collection going forward, in that we collect the stuff of daily life, right? How did Lower East Siders over generations have fun? What did they cook? What did they wear, of course? What did they do for work, which is very often making clothes that other New Yorkers wore. So, you know, within our collection of stuff that was left behind, we have a spool of thread from the 80s, but probably the 1880s. We have a pattern tracer that similarly was used in the late 19th century. But then we have things like, we have playing cards, we have bones from chicken that someone cooked, and then the bones fell beneath the floorboards. So, you know, all those objects then are supplemented by the other main thing that we collect, which is oral histories and stories from former tenement residents, from current tenement residents, from Lower East Siders over generations. And so to us, the objects are really important because of the stories that people tell about them. So
that is beautiful. I mean, I think everyone in this room, or anyone who understands objects of permanence, knows that. I mean, the Tenement Museum was a huge source of inspiration for the way to bring a story forward through an object, because my experience there was that, you know, you have this life, you have a world lived, you have a home, and no one is living there. There is not a person there, there is not a life. So what is it that's carrying the life? And it is those objects that are carrying that sort of permanent story forward, right? So Tenement Museum, I think, are such experts at identifying, like you said, I mean, you bring up chicken bones or you bring up playing cards, like pivoting into how, and you answer that so eloquently. I wonder, how do you decide what is of value for your collection?
Value is such an interesting word for us at the museum, because nothing in our collection has any sort of like monetary value per se, right? A lot of the stuff that we have actually was probably considered trash, right?
people didn't take it with them, left it behind. And to us, that makes it all the more valuable for our stories. So I think for us, value often means like what meaning do we give it as the museum, but then also what meaning does an object get from the way that people connect to it, right? So for example, in the exhibit, Objects of Permanence, right? One of the objects we loaned were sewing shears that belonged to Ramonita Rivera Saez, who was a Puerto Rican Lower East Sider who sewed clothes for a living. And when visitors come and see her apartment and see those scissors, it often sparks memories, connections, and often emotional connections. So for us, that, and we were talking about emotion earlier in the exhibit, that emotional connection to us make something very valuable, and certainly objects that help us tell a really full story of the Lower East Side.
That's beautiful, thank you. I'm going to skip to Valerie because I think that this question of how is very big when I think about the institution of, you know, the museum at FIT. What is the acquisition process like for you in terms of how do you collect, or if you can answer, how do you value? Because that is a huge question, I think, especially when you're thinking about the broad selection that you're bringing in. Can you answer that question for us?
Well, we're looking for fashion that moves fashion forward. So unlike, say, the Costume Institute, which I think looks at primarily in terms of the creativity of the designer and fashion as art, of course we're interested in the creativity of the designer, and we'll look, if someone says, we've got a Saint Laurent, we'll go, okay, what collection was it? Was it an important collection? Was this an important piece from the collection? Did this influence other designers? Did it trickle down through fashion and many people wore knockoffs of it? So there's that, but we also are looking at how fashions start in subcultures or in the streets. I did a big show about Gothic dark glamour, and I noticed that, of course, a lot of designers, from Olivier Teskins to Alexander McQueen and, of course, Rick Owens, did Gothic-inspired fashions, but most of them were not directly copying the goth subculture, because I also interviewed a ton of young goth kids and borrowed things from them. Instead, both the designers and the goths were responding to a very rich visual and cultural history, everything from Byron's poems to, you know, vampire movies that inspired a kind of Gothic sensibility. So this was not a case of designers ripping off a subculture, but of the designers and the kids in the subculture gravitating towards a certain sensibility. So it was kind of fabulous. It got to the point, so many goth kids visited me that, you know, another black-clad young person would come to the guard's desk, and before they even opened their mouth, he'd go, "She's on the 3rd floor." And I really liked it that they thought the show was authentic to what their feelings about the clothes were. Because I know other subcultural shows, it can be hard to explain to people what that kind of identity with a subcultural style is like. So one of the ways we decide what to collect has to do precisely, though, with what exhibitions are we planning. We have more than 50,000 garments and accessories from the 18th century to the present, but we have hardly any more room. So if we get something new, we very often have to sort of start thinking about deaccessioning something else. So we're thinking not just how can we improve the collection as a whole, but how can we respond to the new ideas and story ideas of our curators. So when they want to be doing something, like we have a show that we did last year on the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and so we collected for that, but many times that was just loans. People weren't yet ready to give it up, but we did purchase some things. We have another show coming up next year on Africa's fashion diaspora, and the curators buying from that. We're definitely trying to, you know, decolonize our collection and make it's already much more multicultural and diverse and inclusive than many fashion collections, but we're trying to make it even more so. So that's been something that we've been working on.
Amazing, that sounds so impressive. And I caught the 50th anniversary hip hop show, so that was amazing. I'm sure many other people in this room saw that show. Jess, I'm thinking of the many ways to ask you this question, because I think for us in the room, the idea of, you know, one of our favorite vintage dealers, how they collect feels like such a sort of juicy bit of material. But I think it also, what Valerie brings up is, people only willing to loan and what you let go of and what you keep. So can you answer, what is it that you collect and but how is it that you do form those collections, and how do you let things go? How do you decide what is the voice of Procell? It's not such an exhibition, but what is in the exhibition of the store?
So I think we're actually a really great in-between between your institution and your institution. In a way, we are picking up people's trash sometimes, quite literally and figuratively. Sometimes when you're in like a basement or an attic that hasn't been really cared for or stepped into in 20, 30 years, it's pretty gnarly, but also trying to have an approach, not just rely on the haze of nostalgia to say, oh, this fits in the time period, so we'll put it in the shop. I think Brian and I try to be very, very selective and deliberate in the mix that's highlighted in the store, and also be hyper aware that the mix is changing constantly. So a week like this, where it's Fashion Week, we're dealing with stylists, we're dealing with regular shoppers, we're dealing with tourists, we're dealing with all kinds of people. And so in one run through the store, suddenly the vibe is very different than how we started in the day because of the sales that we've made. So Brian and I are constantly thinking about what is going out, so what should be coming in, what do we think is next, what do we want to be next, because sometimes also when running a store, just because you love something doesn't mean that others will love it too. There has to be this balance and a thought process about it, and I think that's why our shop has survived COVID, been in the same space for 10 years, is because we're constantly trying to think of those things. In terms of letting go or what to keep, I mean, there's always things that you wish you saved, whether from your personal life or from the shop. When we opened, we were really changing, I think, the way that vintage was curated. And so we let go of many things because we wanted to start off really, really, really strong. And that's not to say that we aren't strong now. It's just a different kind of strong as the world has kind of caught up to the vision and the mix that we chose to put forward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm thinking about the mix in Procell, and I'm thinking about, like you said, the start of day is different than the end of day. And if you're constantly, or you're, sort of preserving the feel of the shop, and the feel of the shop is this sort of delicate balance of items. If they all leave the shop, or just a select few, you sort of have to procure that feeling once more and very quickly. So that requires a lot of upkeep. And so I think something that would be interesting for us also to know is, in terms of how you collect, is how do you continue to maintain the collections, which is not something I don't necessarily have as a specific question, but I am curious about how your collections are maintained, and I think people would like to know about that.
I think for us, it's a mix of being really deliberate about what to keep, what to save. Like, maybe we think this is the best iteration, the same way that the museum at FIT would say, this was really impactful. This changed the way something was perceived, or t-shirts were made, or something like exceptional quality. But also I think that part of being in the vintage business, any picker, digger will tell you that, you want to be organized and you try and be organized, but you have to kind of give into the chaos a little bit. And let things get a little messy sometimes, so that then you can come back to them and say, oh, look at this stockpile of things I had put away in this tub organization system. I think it's a delicate balance of being really deliberate and really clinical about what is exceptional, or what could be used in the archive to provide design reference and inspiration, because that is another part of our business, versus what is just going to go over really well in the store.
Right. Yeah, speaking of that sort of clinical archival aspect, how are you working with the professionals at your institution to preserve things? How are you keeping things intact?
Well, we have different departments. We have a conservation department and laboratory. So the care of the clothes is paramount. So that takes trained professionals. You get a master's degree, you have to study chemistry. It's very, very intense to be a conservator. Then we also have registrars who are in charge of documenting the material. You may have read how the British Museum is in trouble because thousands of its objects were stolen by someone who worked there and sold on eBay. And they hadn't even kept track of how many objects they had. I mean, I understand that it's difficult, it's expensive, it takes a long time, but you do have to document for a museum everything you have. You can't say, oh gosh, wow, I had no idea we had that in here, which is a serendipitous, fabulous discovery for you, but I'd be, oh my God, how could this have happened? This wasn't documented. In fact, I once had a person, I won't say who, but the person had a show, and the person tried to bring in more things into the show the morning that the show opened. And I was like, no, you can't do that because we've documented everything that's in here. So we can't have any mystery things suddenly appearing in the show. So we document it, we conserve it, and then the curators are there to try and interpret it through exhibitions, through books and articles. The exhibition team is there to build and create the setting for the exhibitions. We also have staff who are engaged in either actually talking to classes about objects in the collection. We have a special study collection that can be used for classes. So if the main collection's 50,000 objects, we have more than 1,000 objects that are used in hundreds of classes every year. So sometimes professors come in and they talk and we lend them things from the study collection. At other times, our staff goes in and they go through 100 years of fashion history using the objects. So that teaching aspect is very important. And we also give tours to student groups. So, what departments? Oh, and we have a media department, so we're putting a lot of this stuff online as well. So even if you can't come to the museum or come to one of our symposia, you're receiving that information online.
Wonderful, thank you for that. I'm thinking about Tenement, and in this sort of how do you keep things intact, and then I'm thinking value, and I'm getting into this sort of why, because I'm gonna ask you, how do you give value to these things? You're deciding that these things have value, then you're deciding to protect them, and then sort of, the experience at Tenement is very much that there are things that you can engage with and things that you cannot. So how do you make those decisions, and how do you keep things, intact?
That's such a good point too, and I was just thinking, you were saying the teaching is so important because for us, that's really the center of what the museum does, right? The museum is accessible by guided tour only, and you tour recreated apartments of real families who lived in tenements, and so most of the stuff that visitors see in the recreated apartments actually didn't belong to the family, right? These things weren't passed down over generations. They were let go, right? And so sort of getting to that question of what has been let go over time, the museum then purchased objects from eBay, from flea markets, antique shows, to put in to these exhibits, and that's like a whole separate collection, actually. Our wonderful collections manager, Lana Dubin, is the one who keeps track of all of our stuff, but we have a whole separate collection that we've said can be in these apartments that visitors are totally immersed in, right? We don't have anything behind ropes or glass. We want people to feel welcome and feel like they're in someone's home. And so all of those other things that we found in the building, those aren't often on public view. Right. So it's a little bit different because we then really have to give the meaning to the objects through the stories that we tell. And we often get this question of like, oh, is this authentic? And then it kind of becomes another question of what do we mean by authenticity, right? What makes an object authentic? Is it the time period? Is it the story it tells? Is it who owned it or who wore it? Or all of those things. I
have so many questions now.
But yeah, we also similarly, right, put a lot of work into observing the spaces, preserving the spaces. We just finished a huge construction project of a year to preserve our building, which was never built to be a museum. And so to us, that sort of sense of preservation and care, especially for things that weren't considered valuable in their time, is really core.
Yeah, I want to ask for a tip about that, but I also want to ask and sort of get into the why we collect, which I think is so built into the what and the how. But with the why, especially when I think about tenement, there are millions of New Yorkers who have lived in a place. Everyone here lives in a place. Why those stories? Why those families? I know those were the tenants that lived at that exact building, but who do they reflect? And sort of what is really the point of showing the way people live? Please tell us why collect these things, why show them this way?
Sure. As I was preparing for this talk, I kept thinking about, there's this Turkish writer, Orhan Pamuk, who maybe folks are familiar with. He wrote a few years ago a document called A Manifesto for Museums. And the number one thing on this list was that the future of museums is in our own homes. And I think that really captures the essence of the Tenement Museum. And our founders, when they began, there was no collection, there was no building, there were no objects. They just had the idea that there could be a museum that told the stories of basically people who never thought their stories were going to be in museums. Right? People who were immigrants, migrants, folks who weren't wealthy or famous. And it was also important to them to tell a range of stories, right? That it's not just one time period or not just one group of people, one community. And so for us, it's the specificity that helps think about the why, right? And then also the kind of collage or kaleidoscope of stories, and how the things in our collection together tell a story of a family, but then also a story of a community. So, for us, there are these different layers as to how objects are donated to us or come into our collection.
I love that quote you shared, and thank you for that. Can you give us a little tip as to how a family might be able to value what's in their home right now or preserve their story, a small thing that you think people could know and could afford to do without, years of schooling to preserve their family story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all carry, if we have a phone, we have a recording device with us. And so I always encourage people to, if they're having a conversation with someone they love, just press record, ask permission first. But press record, right, and preserve the stories within a household. That's one of the easiest things that we can do when we're telling stories and sharing memories with each other. I also just love the exercise, and I invite you all to do it right now. All the things you're wearing, what you have in your bag, right? Thinking about one of those things with you that carries some meaning for you. And then, share a little story about it, write a story about it. The museum has a website called Your Story, Our Story, where, similar to you all, we don't have unlimited physical space. It's New Yorkers, we can relate. So we created a website where people can share a story of an object, a tradition that carries meaning for their identity. And so that's a way that we can, invite, millions of folks to donate stories. And so, they're thankfully in today's technology-rich age, there's many ways to preserve and share stories with each other.
Amazing. Thank you for that share. I'm going to move to Jess. I'm thinking about why Procell collects. And I think I want to ask, what is the point of collecting people's old clothes and telling new stories with them? What is the purpose of, recycling or upcycling fashion? And what is it that you are saying to New Yorkers when you open your door every day? Why that collection? Why on Delancey? And why now?
Okay, a few there. I'll try and remember them all. So I think why Procell is the way that it is its connection. So it's connection to subcultures, it's connection to, going to a concert and having a band tea. It's like that back and forth of maybe with an old object, be it clothes or a hat or a book or something. But I think in the store, it becomes like, what is the new connection? So when someone puts on a new dress that they're trying on in the store and they light up and you see they're confident, you see that they feel powerful, that is kind of what I hope, and I also know that Procell is for people, that it's a space where you can come and find a new connection. And I know clothes can be seen as maybe like a vanity thing, but we all do put them on, and sometimes it helps you find your people. And so Procell is the place where all these things that mix together of people's stories, people's things that maybe don't all go together in our world, in our New York City world, in our lives, they go together. So it's connection to the old, but also a new connection. Like, what path does that person go on with their new, fab, whatever it is that they picked up today.
Amazing, thank you so much. And Valerie, why tell stories at the museum? Why with fashion? Why with clothing? Why with exhibitions? Why with education and programming? Why continue to push the stories of garments and tell the story, do community storytelling through garments?
Well, fashion is a very exciting and intricate subject that appeals to people because everybody does get dressed in the morning. And many people pretend that they say they're not interested in fashion at all. And I always go, really? Does your mom buy your clothes? And they go, no, of course not. I wear my own clothes. And I go, okay, then I guess you chose them, right? So actually, the first fashion museum was imaginary. And I've discovered this almost by accident. In the later part of the 1700s in London, there's a little letter written in the Spectator magazine where two men are strolling through London and they're seeing all the shops and they go, wouldn't it be interesting if there was like a kind of a gallery for clothes, the way there's a gallery for paintings or for, medals and other important things. And then anytime anyone invented a new fashion, they could come in with a little doll dressed in that fashion, and it would be put in a shelf, and the fashion museum would be built in the shape of a sphinx because of the sort of mysterious aura of fashion. And this sort of fantasy of a fashion museum occurred long before people actually thought of making a specialized fashion museum. And first they made them at World's Fairs as temporary things to show, look what we're doing in fashion. And the French would have galleries full of their couture, and they would have wax mannequins showing getting dressed to go to the opera and so on. And then the Americans would say, look at our corsets that we've made. These are award-winning corsets, and these are will win a gold prize at the Paris Universal Exhibition. So people are all sort of showing what aspects of industry and art and culture they're creating and showing them through clothes. So clothes and fashion have, I think, a social and cultural significance, which is partly to do with individual subjectivity, but partly also to do with the wider culture, their ideas and values. And we can see that changing through clothes. Clothes from the past are really like a little piece of history that still, through a miracle, exists. And so you can extrapolate from that some of the things that people thought and felt when they were making or wearing those clothes.
Thank you for that. I think with our last 10 minutes, we will open up to see if anyone has some questions for any of us. And if not, then I have some follow-up questions. But does anyone have any more things to be curious about? Is that a hand in the back? Yes, it is. Hello. Are they?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I know that my husband, my sister, all these people are getting into genealogy. It's widespread. I don't think it's affecting my museum yet, but I'm hoping that what will happen is that when people donate things, they will increasingly tell us more about them, because many of our clothes, we don't have any real personal provenance. We get them from dealers or from designers. And it's very interesting to know the personal circumstances under which the clothes were purchased or made and worn. I remember my mother gave me once this little book that she'd found at a fair, at a sale, some kind of rummage sale, where a girl had pasted onto the pages of a novel her own little drawings of the dresses that she wore with a little swatch of cloth and a sentence that would say, I wore this, at a party at West Point in August 1916.
I love that.
And the clothes were so up to date. You would have thought it was a copy of French Vogue, which didn't even exist yet in 1916, because it was so up to date. And this little girl, in rural America was copying all of these most fashionable clothes.
Wow, that's amazing. I think another question I'd like to ask is, I love the tip that Kat gave us. I think we would all love a tip from Procell. Can you give us a tip about preserving our things, taking care of our things, fixing things that we are obsessed with and showed up looking different or landed in our hands differently?
So I still do all the laundry for the shop. We wash and clean everything, or dry clean, or tailor. We have a great network of artisans here in the Lower East Side that help us. Sometimes we even go to the same tailor that does all the Met costume repairs if we have something that's really, really unique and special. I would say that the dryer's your enemy. Always wash in cold. You don't need hot water. And I think don't hang your t-shirts. They just stretch the neck out. And I think those are my preservation tips.
Those are fabulous
tips. Because in a weird way, we're still doing the conservation work that a museum is doing. We're just doing it on a much smaller, localized scale. And I take it as a personal pride point when people walk into the store and they don't know what they're walking into, and they say, everything looks so clean and new in here. Yes, it's 30 years old. We've made an effort to try and make it that way.
Thank you. I love that. I love those tips. And as a stylist, I have many tips myself, and I'm always trying to just hoard more and more tips about clothing. Valerie, I'm going to ask you for a tip as well.
I'll give you a very personal one, because people often have special pieces of clothing that they want to especially take care of. And ironically, they often destroy those clothes through their attempts at caring for them. I wore my grandmother's 1926 wedding dress, which she had lovingly saved for many decades, wrapped in tissue paper. Tissue paper is not your friend. It's full of acid. And in the middle of the wedding ceremony, my husband leaned over and whispered, "Pull over your veil." And I looked down, and my grandmother's dress was splitting right over my breast because the acid had eaten into the silk. And so I'm yanking over this lace veil of hers. And so don't put it in commercial tissue paper. Either get acid-free tissue paper or find something like a plain white sheet that you can wrap it in. So be very careful, because it's so tragic when people have specially wanted to save something and what they do turns out to destroy it.
Take it out of the dry cleaning plastic.
Yes, that too.
All the
Plastic is
chemicals,
also
just
bad.
Don't do it, guys.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that story. That's a really valuable story. Just now starting to learn about, all of the ways to archive, and I'm meeting many professionals who have incredible tips. I think that's all from us for today. I think we've left you with tips and roadmaps and guides and how-tos in many different ways, from Delancey Street up to Tenement, up to MFIT, here to Abrons. And so I think that's all from us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so. Ooh, testing, testing. Grady, may I have the mic for 1 second? Sorry. Thank you all so much for joining us. I just wanted to plug that we have the exhibition open until 8 p.m. So if folks haven't seen Objects of Permanence, please head down. The exhibition starts where you came in our Culpeper Gallery and then goes to our underground theater. We also have Objects for Permanence t-shirts on sale in the lobby as well. So if you want to now integrate all of those tips that we learned, washing on cold, don't hang them, don't put them in the tissue, you can buy a shirt so you always remember this experience, right? That's a good plug. Thank you so much for joining us again. Exhibition's open to the 14th. We have guided tours twice a day, every day through the run of the exhibition. So if you want to learn more from our exhibition educator and really have a personalized view into the show, we encourage you to sign up for that tonight as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you all for being here.